Greetings. Glad that you can be with me today. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, as well as the West Mineral Methodist Church in West Mineral, Kansas. Both small churches in rural America, but hey, still the backbone of the church and of faith in our country. And actually, most churches are smaller churches. There are probably more small churches than there are big ones. So, hey, they're still kicking and going and surviving despite all the things that we have gone through throughout the years and are still going through. So I'm glad that you can be with me today. We're looking at the sermon for October 23rd, 2022. Had COVID last week. Everybody else had to get it, a couple years ago or a year ago or so. And for some reason, I waited until a week ago to get it, when everybody else was pretty much gone past it. So anyway, still dealing with some of the after effects. Still have kind of a cough from it, but other than that, still feeling pretty good and glad to have that over with. But anyway, we're looking at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. The Apostle Paul is writing to his friend Timothy. Gives him a letter. It's actually a second letter, Timothy, some encouragement and some instruction. And here he coming more to the end of his letter, looking at what the future holds for him. In 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 to 8. I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. From now on there is reserved for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but also all who have longed for his appearing. May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. One time there was a minister and a taxi driver. Both ended up going to heaven at the same time to meet with St. Peter. And he welcomes them and says, well, I'm going to take you to the places where you're going to spend eternity. Takes a taxi driver first, and they go up a big, long road, up a big hill. And up at the top of the hill is a mansion. Huge, beautiful place. They open the front door, and there's a big chandelier hanging from the ceiling, and these big staircases going up, and out back is a swimming pool with a garden, and just beautiful place. Fantastic. And St. Peter tells the taxi driver, well, this is your reward. This is where you will spend the rest of eternity. Then he turns to the minister, and he says, well, now let's get you settled too. So they go back down the hill, down to the bottom of this hill. There's a little one-room shack. And they open the door, and there's nothing inside except for a straight-back chair and a pull-string light bulb. He says, well, here you go. This is where you get to spend the rest of eternity. And the minister goes, well, wait a minute. I don't understand. There was that taxi driver, gets this huge mansion. I'm down here. I get this little shack. What gives? Well, St. Peter says, well, he really wasn't that good of a taxi driver. But when people rode in his taxi, they prayed. But you weren't really all that good of a preacher. And when you preached, people went to sleep. Anyway, a lot of times when it comes time to do a funeral service for someone that's been a faithful member of the church, been a good believer for many, many years, and they kind of had a good long life. I read this particular passage. This is part of talking about how Paul says, that I have finished the race. I've kept the faith. It's time now for my departure, right? And he has, but is now reserved for him a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give him on that day. And it's to give encouragement to the family for their loved one that has passed away. Yeah, And when Paul writes this letter to Timothy, he's in prison in Rome, not knowing what day will be his last, but more than likely he realizes that he will probably be executed. And so he says, I have fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. So he knows where he's going. He says, he knows that there will be a crown of righteousness for him. And he gives us hope that we who hang in there, we too, it gives us encouragement for what will happen when we get there to that point. And as I get older, I relate more and more to this passage. My time of departure might not be for another 20 or 30 years. Who knows? Might be tomorrow. Who knows? But as I read a lot of obituaries these days, I see some people pretty close to my age listed in those obituaries. So I know, hey, none of us knows how, but we're all eventually going to get there one day. But, Paul had been through a lot of things in his life. He started out as a persecutor of the church, and then later the Lord revealed himself to him, and then he became one of the great leaders of the early church and spent time ministering and preaching all over the area there. But he also had his moments. There were times when he was beaten and thrown in jail. There were times when he was ridiculed and even was shipwrecked at one time. So yes, but he kept on going. He didn't give up. He kept, as he says, he has fought the good fight. He's finished the race. He kept going. He kept the faith. And, we all know people like that in our lives. People that have endured hardship, pain, and suffering, illness, and yet they have kept the faith. They've hung in there. I think of both of my grandmothers who raised their families during the Depression and never really had a whole lot of money. They both on small farms that kind of did what they needed to get by. But they kept their faith. They were loyal to their family and their friends and their church. And so, they fought the good fight. They finished the race. They kept the faith, right? And we also know of people that started out pretty good. Seems like they had everything going good for them, and then somewhere along the line they get off track. We can think of some people that are fairly famous that seemed like they had everything going for them and were doing real well, and then things come to light eventually that reveal that they had not necessarily done what they were supposed to do, and they end their life and their life coming toward an end, and it's not looking too good for them. They have not kept the faith. And we know some at one time were well-respected evangelists who seemed like they had good followings and lots of people were paying attention to them, but they have fallen from grace and find some scandals in their lives, and we've seen that happen too, which has kind of hurt our witness a little bit. But one of them that I can think of, though, is that seems like he didn't seem to have much trouble with Billy Graham. He, as far as I know, no scandals, no things to in his background. He hung in there. He fought the good fight. He finished the race. He kept the faith. And for that, we can be glad. But there are other people, too, that we think of that have gone through many other things as well. Johnny Erickson, for example, who had an accident when she was young, broke her neck, ended up in a quadriplegic in a wheelchair, and yet she kept her faith. She continued to work on it, had a movie made about her life, wrote books, even learned how to paint with just using her mouth, and been a witness for the Lord for many, many years. So, she is definitely done that. And I think of another more person that I know personally that when she was a young woman, a school teacher, and she had to MS came along, had to quit teaching. And she ended up being in a wheelchair, but she kept her faith, and she continued to be a witness, and not only her but also her husband, who cared for her, kept his faith and hung in there and took care of her. So yeah, there are times when people do those things. But not only is it people that have fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith, I think a lot of our churches as well, that not only have done that in the past, but they continue to do that. You know, I've been doing this for around 30 years or so. And I remember looking back at when I started in our particular conference, that practically every church had a full-time pastor back then. They might have do 2 or 3 churches to be able to be full-time, but they still were all full-time pastors. Today, a lot of our churches have part-time people because the money's not there to afford a full-time pastor. And one of the things that happened was, when I started, the health insurance for a family was $350 a month, and we thought that was a lot of money back then. $350 a month for a family plan, but within a few years it went from $350 to $1,200 a month. That's a pretty good size jump in a very short period of time, and there were several churches that they couldn't afford that. Not only that, but the property insurance went up. And so what are they doing? Along with another thing was that attendance was going down. So even though you had all these other things increasing in price, attendance was going down, and along with that was, of course, giving was going down. And so a lot of our churches had to go from having a full-time pastor to a part-time pastor. But despite all these things, the churches hung in there. They found a way to keep going, to fight the good fight, to keep on running the race, and they kept the faith. Yeah. I seem to remember a bishop one time talking about the time that a lot of churches closed. Many, many churches. In fact, most churches probably closed at any time in our recent history was back in the 1920s. Lots of churches closed. Why? It wasn't over finances. This was before the Depression. It wasn't the financial reasons. It wasn't a doctrinal issue that was causing the problem. So why were all these churches closing? And most of them were small, rural churches. Well, it was the advent of the car. The automobile came along. And before that, people, went to church, either walked or they got it, the horse and buggy or some other way like that. And they usually only traveled maybe 5 miles at the most to the closest church. Well, once the car came along, hey, they could go 10, 15, 20 miles to go to church. And to go to a bigger church in town instead of a little church out in the country. And they might actually have a pipe organ, have a choir, have youth activities for the kids. So, yeah, a lot of people at that time left those small churches behind and went to town. And we can't really blame them for that. And we can't say that the small churches were doing anything necessarily wrong. It was just a change in our culture at the time. Wow. And we kind of are in that today, too, that we're kind of in times when the culture is changing and things are different. What the future holds for us and for our churches, we really don't know. What it would be like 5 years from now or 10 years from now. But the main thing is that we keep on fighting the good fight. We finish the race. We keep the faith. You know, our bishop told us that the COVID outbreak has caused some significant changes for a lot of our churches. That it accelerated some of the things that were already happening. It only made them things happen faster. And that we're like 10 years ahead of where we might have been had not COVID come along. Part of it was the technology, that a lot of churches started using technology to reach out beyond, because at the time people couldn't come to regular services, and so that went along. But also several people quit coming during the COVID outbreak, and many of them didn't come back. Attendance had a tendency to be going down anyway, and it only had gotten us to where we're at much faster. But despite all that, many of our churches are still fighting the good fight. They're still in the race. They're still keeping the faith. And what do we get for that? Well, it tells us that there's reserved for me a crown of righteousness, right? When we go traveling, Susan always likes to get a reservation. So someplace. She doesn't want to just go somewhere and then try to find some place to stay. She likes to know that she's got some place reserved. And if we look at that, it says, there is reserved for me a crown of righteousness. That we've already got that. It's already there for us. That Jesus said, I will go to prepare a place for you. Yeah, and where I am, you will be also. And that we can be, and then Paul also talks about that our citizenship is in heaven. It doesn't say our citizenship will be in heaven. Our citizenship is in heaven already. And that we have a crown of righteousness reserved for us. Now, crowns are usually something, of course, part of it might be talking about, like he said, running the race. The winner of the race got a laurel wreath that they put on their head, because they were the winner of the race, so that signified that. Or the thing of royalty is getting crowns, and we kind of think of that as being treated that way. But to me, that doesn't. I think it's more talking about the reward that we'll receive, not necessarily what the specific reward will be, but that we're going to receive a reward. We don't know what that's going to be like exactly. We don't know exactly what heaven will be like. We don't know, it'll be a beautiful place. It'll be a wonderful place where there's no more death and dying, sickness, illness. We won't get tired or have new bodies. There's a lot to look forward to. But we don't know exactly how that is going to all be. And the closest thing I can think of, for me personally anyway, is we went to spent a couple weeks at a Methodist camp in Montana. Kind of rural Montana, out in the mountains, just north of Yellowstone. Beautiful place with mountains all around, trout fishing. The temperature never got above 80 degrees during the day. It was great. Of course, I was there during the summertime. Winter might be a different story. But to me, that was the closest thing to heaven I'll ever experience. And somebody might say, well, why don't you like that so much? Why don't you just go live there? Well, like I say, in the wintertime, it may not be as nice as it is. And, we also got to thank the family is here. So, that's some reasons for sticking around this part of the area. But the thing is, no matter what, none of us knows when our time of departure will come. We know it'll be someday. Until that time of departure comes, that we continue to fight the good fight, we continue to run the race, and we continue to keep the faith. Well, thank you for coming with me and listening to my ramblings on, and hope that this was a blessing to you. And may the Lord go with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.